Welcome back to the class, and this is the final session on Ulrich Beck and Risk Society, and this is also the final session of this particular week, and we will be moving to the 9th week next with the next class with a discussion on the ideological critiques of globalization. So let us continue the discussion on Ulrich Beck and Risk Society. So the third thesis, the third point that he's talking about is non-compensability. Compensatibility. The first one is delocalization. Second one is incalculableness, and the third one is non-compensability. The security dream of the first modernity was based on the scientific utopia of making the unsafe consequences and dangers of decisions ever more controllable. Accidents could occur as long as and because they were considered compensable. If the climate has changed irreversibly, if progress in human genetics make irreversible interventions in human existence possible, if terrorist groups already have weapons of mass destruction available to them, then it's too late. So this whole question of the scenario that we are not able to, first of all, we are not able to, these risks are not in a particular locality. We are not able to foresee that. They are not able to calculate when it happens, where it happens. Third one is we don't know even how to compensate that. They are not amenable to compensation. Okay, because the kind of catastrophe, for example, for a nuclear disaster or a widespread consequences of food adulteration or some chemical warfare. These things would be something beyond our understanding of how it can be compensated, because they all go beyond the conventional understanding of danger, harm, and negative consequences imposed on people and other sections. So he argues that the key institutions of modernity, such as science, business, and politics, which are supposed to guarantee rationality and security, find themselves confronted by situations in which their apparatus no longer has a purchase and the fundamental principles of modernity no longer automatically hold good. This is a repetition. This is from the second essay, second article. This is again the repetition of the same point that we argued. The kind of a legitimacy that these institutions had, whether it is political or economic or scientific establishment, their apparatus no longer has a purchase and the fundamental principles of modernity no longer automatically hold good. Indeed, the perception of their rating changes from trustees to suspects. They are no longer seen only as an instrument of risk management, but also as a source of risk. Tragic individualization as a consequence, tragic individualization. As a consequence, everyday life in the world risk society is characterized by a new variant of individualization. The individual must cope with the uncertainty of global world by himself or herself. Here, individualization is a default outcome of a failure of expert system to manage risk. And this point, I am inviting your attention to Giddens' argument about expert systems. I hope you remember that we discussed about expert systems and symbolic tokens. So he argued that in the modern period, in the modernity, we established a host of expert systems. Okay, a car, an aeroplane, or a financial transaction, online financial transaction, or a credit card, okay, or a health checkup. All these things are on the basis of expert systems. Okay, because we do not know anything about the pilot who is flying our plane, about the mechanical accuracy of its machines, of its engine, of its safety apparatus. We have no idea about it. We have no assurity about it, but we simply trust. Okay? We simply trust. We think that there are experts who have taken care of all these things, and we simply give ourselves into their promise. So now each of these things, individualization is a default outcome of a failure of expert systems and manage risk. And here in this light of impending crisis of this or a pervasive sense of risk in a modern world, whether when you eat, you do not know what exactly are its contents, what exactly it contains, or in a financial transaction, or in your internet transaction, your privacy, okay, about your photos, about your message that you send. There's no guarantee that it's not being sold, or it's not being leaked, or it's not being used for unwanted purposes. So here, every individual is forced to look up or herself for his or her own forms of security, and that leads to kind of higher forms of individualization. The individual is forced to mistrust the promise of the rationality of these key institutions. We know that banking system, of course, all of us have bank accounts, but we know how risky it can be, how your ATM, your online transaction can be fudged. A host of other possibilities are there. As a consequence, people are thrown back onto themselves. They are alienated from expert systems but have nothing else instead. Disembedding without embedding, this is the ironic, tragic formula for this dimension of individualization in the world, this society. So you are disembedding, you are no longer able to identify yourself with a particular system, but then you are not able to re-embed somewhere else. You have no other alternatives other than these systems of these systems whose legitimacy are deeply questioned. However, and this is also part of the tragic irony of the individualization process, the individual whose sense fail him and her in the face of ungraspable threats to civilization, who, thrown back on himself, is blind to dangers, remain at the same time unable to escape the power of definition of expert systems, whose judgment he cannot, yet must trust. Sustaining an individual self of integrity in world of risk society is indeed a tragic affair. Okay, so sustaining an individual self of integrity in a world of risk society is indeed a tragic affair. We know that we are forced to live in cities where it is full of toxic air. The medical system that we depend upon, it could be exploitative. It can have serious negative consequences. So a host of things we are forced to really depend upon, and then find ourselves in a compromising situation. So let us summarize. The theory of the world risk society addresses the increasing realization of the irrepressible ubiquity of radical uncertainty in the modern world. The same point that we discussed so far, we are all talking about the uncertainty. It's a irrepressible ubiquity of radical uncertainty of the modern world. The basic institutions, the actors of first modernity, science and expert systems, the state, commerce and the international system, including the military responsible for calculating and controlling manufactured uncertainties, are undermined by growing awareness that they are inefficient, their actions even counterproductive. Okay, any of these things, whether it's military or state apparatus or these things can also be counterproductive. This does not happen haphazardly but systematically. Radicalization of modernity produces this fundamental irony of risk. Science, the state and the military are becoming part of the problem that they are supposed to solve. A very important point. The science, the state and the military, which are supposed to protect you from the external enemy, are becoming a part of the problem that they are supposed to solve. That is what reflexive modernization means. We are not living in a post-modern world, but in a more modern world. It is not the crisis, but the victory of modernity, which through the logics of an unintended and unknown side effects undermines the basic institutions of first modernity. I want you to maybe underline this section and then have a very close look at this particular section. Here he has defined it well. What does it mean to be late modernity? This is what the reflexive modernization means. We are not living in a post-modern world, and this is a point that I have been repeating ever since the beginning of the course when we talk about Giddens or Harvey or Beck, that they are against the argument of a postmodern world, but they argue that the modernity has become radicalized, it has become so successful, and the success of modernity is what actually has brought in all these kind of uncertainties and complexities, which through the logics of unintended and unknown side effects undermines basic institutions of first modernity. Now, how does the proclaimed enlightenment function of global risk express itself? 6 components which make up for the cosmopolitan moment of world risk society. Now, this part of this essay, Beck again turns into looking into the possibilities, okay, the creative possibilities of a risk society, and he argues that there's a cosmopolitan moment comes into picture, something very different from the traditional world, very different from the modern world, where we will be forced to act with a more cosmopolitan energy and cosmopolitan spirit. And this kind of an argument, this kind of a line of thinking, even this optimism can be seen in many of Ulrich Beck's argument when he talks about a cosmopolitan sociology, when he talks about cosmopolitan state, cosmopolitan society, cosmopolitan moment. He believes that these difficulties will push you to become more open-minded, to be more accommodative of the other, and then to be more inclusive, to be more sensitive to other people's identities and other things. But we don't know, because Beck has written it during 2005, where we had far better optimism about a positive globalization. Now, sitting in 2020, I must say that not many people are sharing the kind of enthusiasm and then optimism that Beck shared about the prospects of globalization. So that's what we are going to discuss in the coming class. Now, there is a serious crisis of globalization. Many of the positive, very glorious, very glamorous, romantic thing that we anticipated about globalization simply has not come true. And there is a reversal, of course, not to the original position, but a kind of a different direction is taking place. So he says that there is an involuntary enlightenment will take place as a result of this impending scenario of global risk society. Global risks have two sides: the probability of a possible catastrophe and a social vulnerability through catastrophe. One is the probability of a possible catastrophe and the social vulnerability through catastrophe. How the vulnerable section are seen as bearing the brunt of catastrophe, and then people are forced to acknowledge that. And he gave the example in the article. He gave the example of cyclones in the US, and where the whole world was forced to look at the poorer section of the US. So he says that this such a global crisis will turn attention to the poorer section, and then everybody will be forced to recognize and reconcile with the whole situation. And the world will be forced to acknowledge and act upon vulnerable sections who are deeply affected by the emerging risk and catastrophe. And to be honest, I personally do not really share this kind of optimism that any catastrophe will naturally force everybody to take account of that. Even now, I don't really share that kind of an optimism, because unless there is some very radical redefinition takes place in much larger, much deeper structural issues like capitalism or the nation state, nothing much is going to happen. The possibility of alternative governments in a globalized world. Again, he is optimistic of that. He believed that at least the European Union will become an example of that, a global, alternative cosmopolitan state. But we know that even the European Union suffered a setback with the Brexit, and we are not seeing anything as of now in that positive sense, where nation states will become more, better and other things. Second one is an enforced communication across all differences and borders. So this is again yet another point Beck argues will be a forced moment of cosmopolitanism, that risk is the involuntary, unintended, compulsory medium of communication in the world of irreconcilable differences, in which everyone revolves around themselves. Hence, a publicly perceived risk compels communication between those who do not want to have anything to do with one another. It assigns obligations and costs to those who refuse them and who often even have current law on their side. In other words, risks cut through self-absorption of cultures, languages, religions, and systems, as well as national and international agenda of politics. They overturn their priorities and create context for actions between camps, parties, and quarreling. What he basically says is that this scenario of an impending risk will force everybody to communicate with each other. You will not be able to be comfortable in your silos. You will be forced to deal with the other. You will be forced to communicate with the other because these risks are of a global character. They are of a universal character, and any solution is possible only by communicating with the other, by collaborating and cooperating with the other. Third one, he says the political power of catharsis, the possibility of catastrophes to produce political catharsis, where where these risks are able to produce a sense of catharsis for the political actors to make them more kind, to make them more understanding, to make them react with more sense of compassion and other things. And the fourth one is the enforced cosmopolitanism. Global risk activates and connects actors across borders who otherwise do not want to have anything to do with one another. I propose in this sense that a clear distinction can be made between philosophical and normative ideas of cosmopolitanism on the one hand and the impure actual cosmopolitanization on the other. So here he is talking about that these risks can actually bring in a sense of forced cosmopolitanism, where you will be forced to interact with the other, accommodate the other, or to be friendly with the other, to accept the other. And all these things he considered as the impure, not the negative, impure or actual cosmopolitanization on the other. And he says that this is very different from the kind of philosophical understanding of cosmopolitanism, which comes from a much larger enlightened understanding of the world, that you think that you're all part of the same world, and there's nothing radically different between you and the other, and you need to develop a political philosophy that must be inclusive of the other. So that is a kind of a political foundation of cosmopolitanism. But the second one, this impure one, the real one, he says, can also take place. And here he makes this argument about a cosmopolitanization. And in one of his lectures, maybe you will find it in the YouTube, he brings up this argument about a forced cosmopolitanization, where because of the migration with the emergency, for example, Europe is experiencing a forced cosmopolitanization, where they are forced to acknowledge the other in their neighborhood, in their own houses, in their own society. And it's not coming out of a generosity or magnanimity to accept and accommodate the other. It's a process of economic processes. It's a product of war. It's a product of famine. It's a product of global misery. You are forced to acknowledge the other, and that can have very negative consequences as well, as what we see, the rise of xenophobia, the rise of nationalistic, jingoistic posturing. So all these things are a process of this enforced cosmopolitanization. And the fifth one, risk as a wake-up call in the face of a failure of government. What Beck talks about, whether we will be able to redesign our forms of governance with better energy, better sensibility, better idea, rather than making it more and more centralized, hierarchical, and then bureaucratic. And the sixth point, which by mistake appeared in the previous slide, is about a possibility of an alternative government, as maybe something similar to a cosmopolitan state, a state who is not bogged down by the idea of defining its own member and then treating the other in a discriminatory manner, a state which has the magnanimity to look at every people as belong to their own people. So these are the main arguments of Ulrich Beck regarding his theorization on risk society. So as I mentioned in the one of the previous classes, Ulrich Beck became a point of discussion among many journalists and many public media, especially in the background of this COVID-19 pandemic, because many of these points that he elaborated so far is very, very applicable in the new era of the new normalcy that we are undergoing currently. His idea about the way in which state governments work, the way in which the scientific community had no clue about how to deal with the virus, to deal with it, to make sense of it, the kind of projections, the kind of statistical projections, the kind of the various ways in which they wanted to deal with the thing. So Beck became a very, very important reminder of a very rigorous sociological analysis of our contemporary times. So just to summarize, Ulrich Beck, the German sociologist, is a very, very important figure in the contemporary social science as a theorist of late modernity, theorist of reflexive modernization, theorist of risk society. He is a prolific writer, a very important voice, very important figure in the globalization literature. Okay, so we are closing this chapter, 8th-week chapter, where we discussed Ulrich Beck as a significant scholar and looked at his arguments about state and risk society. And we will move on to the next week, where we discuss the critics of globalization, especially two people, Antonio Negri and Michael Hart, and their very famous thesis by name, The Empire. Okay, so see you then. Thank you.